Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio. Today we are looking at the sequel trilogy in the Star Wars Saga, that is episodes 7, 8, and 9. Now, an important note, I am omitting Rogue One and Solo from this episode since those movies were their own separate thing, and those two movies will be featured on another episode later down the line. Now, what we're really going to be looking at in this trilogy is how is it handled since George Lucas no longer had creative control. Was it for the better, or was it a detriment? As always, if you want to stay up to date on the MetrObelisk Radio uploads on whatever platform you are watching this on, then follow the blog, metrobeliskradio.blogspot.com. I make posts and announcements there long before I post to social media. So without further delay, let's tear right into the sequel trilogy. As always with these retrospectives, we start off with the creative team. Now, I'm going to break this down into directors and writers. So, as far as directors are concerned, there were only two directors for this trilogy, and those were J.J. Abrams, who directed episodes 7 and 9, and Rian Johnson, who directed episode 8. Let's start with J.J. Abrams. His directorial debut was Mission Impossible 3, and then he also directed Star Trek, Super 8, Star Trek Into Darkness before he jumped over to Star Wars. And with Rian Johnson, he was mostly known for being an indie director who did his directorial debut Brick with, I think it was Joseph Gordon-Levitt was in that one. He followed that up with The Brothers Bloom and Looper. And he also directed a couple episodes of Breaking Bad, and that's where most of you might know his name from. Now, if we're going to jump into writers, we have to obviously start with the man himself, George Lucas, because he is credited under the writing team. However, he is only a characters created by credit, meaning he had really no creative involvement in this trilogy. So let's start with the writers on just The Force Awakens. So we have Lawrence Kasdan coming back. He obviously wrote The Empire Strikes Back with George Lucas, along with Raiders of the Lost Ark and Return of the Jedi, and he would go on to write Solo: A Star Wars Story with his son, Jonathan Kasdan. Next up is J.J. Abrams. Now most of you will know him as the creator of the TV shows Alias and Lost. I almost said Alien there for some reason. But in terms of movies, he wrote the movie Regarding Henry starring Harrison Ford, Forever Young starring Mel Gibson. He was one of the writers on Armageddon, I believe, and he also wrote Super 8, which was just an homage to older Steven Spielberg films. And the final writer on The Force Awakens was Michael Arndt. He wrote the little hit movie called Little Miss Sunshine, Toy Story 3, Oblivion, the science fiction movie with Tom Cruise and Morgan Freeman, the sequel to The Hunger Games, Catching Fire, and Inside Out, and he really hasn't written anything since The Force Awakens. Now, the writers on The Last Jedi was only one guy, and that was Rian Johnson. And Rian Johnson is the type of director that he writes and directs his own stuff, so he wrote Brick, The Brothers Bloom, and Looper before episode 8. Now we move on to the final movie in this trilogy in terms of the writers, and that was Rise of Skywalker. So the first guy we're going to look at is Derek Connolly. Now possibly this is just an in-name only credit. He wrote the movies Safety Not Guaranteed, Jurassic World, Kong Skull Island, and Pokemon Detective Pikachu. Next up on that list is Colin Trevorrow. Now, this one is definitely an in-name only credit because he was fired from Episode 9, and his biggest writing projects were the Jurassic World movies. And then J.J. Abrams came back to write Episode 9. I already covered him just a minute ago. And the final writer on this was Chris Terrio. Chris Terrio wrote Argo, Batman v Superman, and the Justice League movies before Episode 9. So with the creative team out of the way, let's tear right into the characters of The Force Awakens. So to start off the character portion, let's first look at Daisy Ridley as Rey, an orphan that was raised as a scavenger in the desert that ends up going on this grand adventure. Now the main problem with her arises early on when they make her basically just good at everything. They make her a good pilot, a good mechanic, which is believable because if you know how to rip shit apart, you probably know how to put it back together. They also make her a sharpshooter later on, and a master of her force abilities with absolutely no training, and a master with a lightsaber with no training. This is the very definition of a Mary Sue, Gary Stu style character. Now let's move on to John Boyega as Finn. Finn was a great idea for a character, a stormtrooper who defected. Now we find out that he was taken by the First Order as a child, and after his first battle, he decided to enlist Poe, who's been taken prisoner and escapes. The name Finn is actually given him by Poe after Finn tells him his name of FN 2187. Now, there was a poster of Finn holding Luke's lightsaber in the marketing for this movie, leading everyone to believe that he was going to be the lead for this trilogy. Remember, he was also the first character that we saw in the teaser trailer for the movie, because Snoke had a voiceover that goes, "There has been an awakening. Can you feel it?" And he rises up onto the screen. Again, a great idea. A stormtrooper who defected that now could be Force sensitive. Something that has never been done in a Star Wars movie before. Now let's transition to Oscar Isaac as Poe Dameron. Now he's the Han Solo type character, except that he's already working with the Resistance. And I'll get into the Resistance in the narrative portion of this. Now, he originally was supposed to die during the escape with Finn, so as a result, his character isn't really fleshed out beyond the fact that he's a good pilot. And then we get to Adam Driver as Kylo Ren, the masked villain who's introduced. Basically, he acts like an edgy teenager, and he acts like he's in some sort of cult that follows Darth Vader. When something doesn't go his way, he throws temper tantrums by taking his lightsaber and just slashing everything in sight. At some point, he does become unmasked, and we find out that there's no reason for Kylo Ren to even be a masked villain other than the fact that Darth Vader had a mask, because Kylo Ren's face has absolutely no deformities. However, let's get back to Darth Vader. Darth Vader's mask was a necessity for him to stay alive. It was a part of his breathing apparatus. Kylo Ren, his mask is all just for show. Now let's move on to Domhnall Gleeson as General Hux. Now, he's the guy that wants to achieve power, and he's just angry all the time in this movie, and there's really nothing else to this character. They tried to make him like he was the Grand Moff Tarkin to Kylo Ren. Now, the issue with that is General Hux is in the entire trilogy, not just this one movie. So as the series progresses, the character digresses into the stupid territory. Now let's get to Andy Serkis as Supreme Leader Snoke. He's built up as the Emperor Palpatine of this trilogy, the ultimate bad guy. Nothing is really said about him other than wait for the sequels and you'll learn more. All we see of him in this movie is on a hologram talking to General Hux and Kylo Ren throughout this movie. Now we move on to Harrison Ford as Han Solo. 30 plus years after Return of the Jedi, he returns to being a smuggler since his son, Ben Solo, aka Kylo Ren, turned evil. Now, I feel that this wasn't a natural progression. Why would he leave Leia to go off back to his smuggling days when he hadn't done that since before Episode 4? This was a total regression of the character. Then we get into Peter Mayhew as Chewbacca. He's still just Han's co-pilot. He serves his purpose. Basically, Han is his yin and Chewbacca is Han's yang. Then we get to Carrie Fisher as Leia, becomes a general in The Resistance, like how she was back in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. Same reasons as Han Solo. After Ben turned evil, she returned to what she knew. Another thing that didn't feel like a progression, only a regression. Mark Hamill as Luke Skywalker. He's only in this movie for the last minute. We see his face and there is no dialogue, not even one word from Luke. Now, I want to end this character portion off with Gwendolyn Christie as Captain Phasma. Boy, oh boy, she was built up to be this big, badass villain in the marketing, and then she was only in a few scenes and used for comic relief in the movie. What an absolute waste of a potentially badass character that wasn't the main villain. Now with the character portion out of the way, let's dig right into the narrative. So the crawl opens up saying that Luke Skywalker has disappeared and there is a map to find him. The Resistance is trying to find it to bring him back to the fight, and the First Order is trying to find it essentially to kill him. Now this leads into the first major problem with this movie. In the opening crawl, it is established that there is a new Galactic Republic. So why does a Resistance even exist? Wouldn't the First Order be that resistance to the greater power? Even still, where did the First Order even come from? Now, I could believe that Palpatine had contingency plans in the case of his untimely death so that the Empire could live on long past him. But none of this is ever explained in the movie. It's just the First Order equals the new Empire, and this new Empire essentially came out of nowhere. So getting back to it, after Poe gives up the map piece to BB-8, Kylo Ren captures him and decides to wipe out the entire village on Jakku. Why? Yeah, why? Why wipe out an entire village after you got the guy you need to find the map? That's just essentially a kick the dog moment. You know, they really want you hating Kylo Ren because, oh my god, innocent villagers get slaughtered. And no wonder FN 2187 just walked away from him. Now, after Finn and Poe escape the First Order back to Jakku, they crash and Finn is the only one to really walk away with no broken bones or anything. Now, I believe that originally Poe was supposed to die in that sequence, and that would explain how Finn found Poe's jacket, and it would also explain why Poe never went back to look for Finn on Jakku, because this is the guy who helped you escape, and you're just going to leave him to die in the desert? No, Poe... I believe that Poe basically staged his death, but in the original script, I think Poe wasn't supposed to come back. Then Finn comes across Rey while the First Order is essentially bombing the hell out of out of the village on Jakku. And guess what they leave Jakku in? The Millennium Falcon. So they leave the desert planet in the Millennium Falcon. Now, for someone who never piloted the Falcon, she knew her way around it pretty well, which is very skeptical. Anyways, it leads to a dogfight with two TIE fighters, and she's piloting with skills that only a skilled pilot really would know. And it's more than just, hold on, I can shake them, as Han is just turning to the left. Getting back to that, after the dogfight, it leads to a moment where Rey and Finn are just going, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, did you see that? Oh my god, I can't believe we did it! Basically fanboying throughout that entire fucking section, and it got real old real quick. Whereas in A New Hope, Luke was not billed as the best pilot in the galaxy at that point. If he was, then why were Han and Chewie needed to take Obi-Wan and Luke to Alderaan? And even at the Death Star battle, there were 2 trench runs before Luke attempted. In one of the trench runs, it was successful in the sense that the bomber didn't die, but he missed the target. Luke's trench run was essentially just a last-ditch effort to blow it up, and even then, he still needed assistance from Han, who got Darth Vader off of his back, and Obi-Wan essentially telling him, use the Force. Now, Han and Chewie in this movie were just happened to be in the neighborhood in time to retrieve the Falcon coming off of Jakku, and it leads to another action scene, blah, 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 blah. This movie gets really boring just with how much action it crams in with no real substance. Then we see Maz Kanata's cantina because, well, the original movie had a cantina scene, so we gotta have a cantina scene. And this cantina sequence is where I really take issue with the movie, more so to what it led to outside the movie, and that's Rey's Force Vision. This Force Vision led to 2 things. The first being it was teasing the Knights of Ren, which probably would have played a much bigger role in the sequels, and the second being, who are Rey's parents? My response to the second point is, who the hell cares? But online it was, is she a Palpatine? Is she a Kenobi? Is she a Skywalker? My response, why would you want to tie her to a legacy character like Kenobi, Palpatine, or Skywalker? All that would accomplish is the Star Wars universe would go from being this big, expansive universe to now shrinking down to the size of a fucking pea. Why not have Rey be her own character so the universe could essentially expand? Oh, I haven't even gotten to Starkiller Base, and all this is bigger Death Star. Now, Starkiller Base has a huge gap in logic. Now, Starkiller Base is a planet-killing planet, but the weapon used to destroy the planet is drained from the energy from the star. If the star dies, then not only does the planet die, the solar system dies because there's no center of gravity. There's no orbit. So what would the First Order do to use that weapon ever again after the first time it's been fired? That star is dead. And stars just don't rebirth out of nowhere. A star has to come from something. So the movie essentially turns into blow up Death Star 3. But there are other things that happen on Starkiller Base other than blow up Death Star 3 to the movie's credit. Now, Rey uses the Force to build up the resiliency to Kylo Ren's torture after she gets captured by him, then somehow turning it around to read his mind. Now, it would have been believable if she just had that resiliency come out of nowhere because, okay, fine, that's believable. But now she can mind read with no training. She also pulls off a Jedi mind trick. Now, granted, it took her 3 times to pull it off, but she still pulled it off. How? She has absolutely no training in the ways of the Force. How does she know how to essentially pull off this move? And the big takeaway from Starkiller Base on the planet level really was Han Solo's death. The movie really dropped the ball when it came to this moment for one reason. Rey and Finn witnessed his death, not Luke, his best friend of 30 plus years, and not Leia, his wife of 25 plus years. Han dying meant absolutely nothing to Rey and Finn since they only knew him for a couple of days, whereas Luke and Leia, like I said, knew him for about 30 plus years up to that point. Now let us get to the lightsaber duels of the movie, the first being Finn versus Kylo Ren. Now Finn gets his ass handed to him, surprise surprise there. What we don't see in this fight, however, is any cut limbs from these lightsabers. Now cut limbs were in the first 6 movies, and at this point, it is common knowledge that if you get cut in the arm by a lightsaber, you lose the fucking arm. So Finn getting cut in the spine from the lower back up should have killed him, but it didn't. Also, Kylo Ren at one point takes a swipe to the leg. Why did Kylo not lose the leg? This is where the discussion of Disney doesn't understand lightsabers comes from. If you're going to change something that fundamental about the franchise, people are going to notice. Then we have Rey versus Kylo Ren. Now, when this moment started, when the lightsaber was being pulled from the snow by the Force, I originally thought that this was going to be Luke's grand entrance. The lightsaber flings across the screen, building up to this master versus apprentice fight, and nope, Rey fucking catches it. Then Rey beats Kylo Ren despite the fact that Rey has received no training in lightsaber fighting versus a guy who had years of training. The defense, oh, he was injured from Chewbacca's bolt caster blast. The response, then how did he beat Finn? Now, the movie ends with the map to Luke Skywalker being made whole because R2-D2 had the majority of the map stored in his database somehow. How did it happen? Who knows, but it was just because plot. Just plot. Then Rey leaves to go find Luke. She does, and then the movie ends. Yay! So what was the reception for The Force Awakens? Well, this movie received a 93% critic rating on Rotten Tomatoes out of 430 critic reviews, and an audience score of 86% out of 234 and 65 audience reviews. Now on Metacritic, this movie has a Metascore of 80 out of 55 critic reviews, and a user score of 6.8 out of 10 out of 7,410 ratings. And on IMDb, this sits at a 7.9 out of 10 out of 836,132 reviews. Now, this movie was made on a budget of $245 million, and it grossed $2,068,223,624 back in 2015. So if we adjust for inflation in 2020 dollars, that would be $2,252,325,954.29. So it's safe to say that despite my personal opinions on the movie, it was both a hit with critics and a hit with audiences, not just in terms of score, but fiscally as well. I want to end this section with some final thoughts on The Force Awakens itself. And to me, this simply was a remake of A New Hope, just like what Star Trek Into Darkness was for the Star Trek series, which is essentially just a remake of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. You can't just recycle the plot from the original movie and expect no one to notice. So what was the point of The Force Awakens? To start a new trilogy? With whom at the helm? Rey is an all-powerful Jedi, even though she has no training. Kylo Ren is a whiny little brat who only became that because he was unmasked. Or was it meant to pull at your nostalgia heartstrings because, oh my god, Star Wars is back? If Disney needed to prove that they knew how to handle Star Wars by making a remake, why couldn't people just buy the DVDs or Blu-rays of the original movies and see them for themselves? If you're going to move forward with the franchise, then actually take a step forward. 30 plus years after Return of the Jedi, and we still have X-Wings and TIE Fighters. Also, this is a sequel to 6 other movies. So if this is just a remake of Episode 4, then how can this movie be Episode 7? Because remember, The Phantom Menace was not a remake of the original. So, I'll close it off with this. In a nutshell, this movie was made simply to pull at your nostalgia heartstrings. Whatever plot was here to set up the new trilogy is paper thin at best. The rest of the movie is just nothing but fan service. Hey guys, Millennium Falcon. Hey guys, Han Solo, Chewbacca, Leia, and Luke are back. Oh, yay. Hey guys, bigger Death Star. Because remember, as the old saying goes, the bigger the better. Hey guys, remember the trench run? So on and so forth. Now with The Force Awakens out of the way, let's move on to The Last Jedi. And we're going to start off like we did with The Force Awakens and talk about the characters, but we're going to start off with the returning characters in this movie. So the first one is Rey. Now in this movie, we see her during her quote-unquote Jedi training, and she stays with Luke for the good majority of the movie. She doesn't really fight alongside the Resistance very much, except at the very end. But we do learn the origin of her parents, quote-unquote. They were nobodies, essentially drunkards that sold her for beer money. Now, I was actually okay with that narrative decision because it's now letting Rey become her own character. Now let's move on to Finn. And pretty much, they did this character dirty in this movie, and I will dive into that point more during the narrative portion of The Last Jedi. We see him basically flee because he wants to save Rey, in the sense that if she tried to come back while the First Order were hunting the Resistance, she would get killed quite easily. Which are very noble intentions, and by this point, because he's not an actual member of the Resistance, but he gets called selfish for doing this move. He's essentially got no dog in this fight between the Resistance and the First Order because he still wants to flee so that he doesn't get shot by them for being a traitor. Then we have Poe, and we see him in more of a commander role in this movie, but he's not allowed to be a commander. So essentially, he's a stupidvisor. And if you don't know what a stupidvisor is, it's basically you get promoted as a supervisor, but you don't have the authority to do anything. You have to seek the approval from somebody else. And he gets demoted after making a decision that could help the Resistance in the very, very near future that does cost lives, but it saved a lot more in just a little bit down the line. Then we have Kylo Ren. He's still pretty much whiny. He doesn't deliver the death blow to Leia. So other than him turning bad for the sake of being bad, there's not much to this character in this movie. Then we have General Hux. Now, he was someone that should have died in The Force Awakens. Now that he's here, he's just the angry right-hand man that wants more power. He's not really the Grand Moff Tarkin of this trilogy. He wants to be the one to lead the First Order, but that falls to Kylo after Kylo slays Snoke. Then we get to Snoke, and they essentially waste him in this movie. He was built up to be this big, bad villain of the trilogy, and now, boop, he's dead. Kylo Ren just killed him unceremoniously. Now let's get to Luke. There were questionable decisions that I'll get into during the narrative, but this Luke Skywalker didn't feel like Luke Skywalker. He went from being very optimistic at the end of Return of the Jedi to being this nihilistic hermit that just wants the Jedi Order to die instead of him trying to rebuild it for himself. Yes, the Jedi Code in the prequel trilogy was dated by design, but why not rewrite the code so the same events from the prequel trilogy don't happen again? Then we go on to Leia. She's basically the same general that we saw in The Force Awakens. We actually see her more of an active military role here than we ever did in the original trilogy. And then with regards to Chewbacca, this movie proves that there's no reason for him to exist without Han Solo. He's just really there to pilot the Millennium Falcon as well as be there for Rey. And let's end this off with Captain Phasma. Oh, what a waste of a character. Her character only pops up in a couple of scenes and is killed by Finn very quickly. Another unceremonious death by a character that was built up to be this big, badass character for the trilogy, and they do absolutely nothing with her. So with regard to new characters in The Last Jedi, there's only really 3 that really stick out, and that's Kelly Marie Tran as Rose Tico being the first. Now, in this movie, she's basically a useless character. I believe that she was only there to really be the love interest for Finn, and she does completely rob him of a heroic moment. I'll get into that later. And there's no other reason really for her to exist in this series outside of that. Then we see Laura Dern as Vice Admiral Holdo. Now, she comes in after Leia falls into a coma, and she's the type that told no one on her crew the plan, which basically led him to stage a mutiny, which shows that she's not a good leader, because a good leader unites people. If there are people within your ranks that feel that in order to save everyone's lives to stage a mutiny, then there's something wrong with you. And I'll dive into this point a little bit later. And finally, we see Benicio del Toro as DJ. Now, he's the thief that Rose and Finn are basically forced to work with after they couldn't get the Master Codebreaker. The issue with his character is he had the keys to the cell that he was staying in when Rose and Finn met him in the jail cell. If he had the keys to get out, why didn't he just get out sooner? Now, I want to end this off with a fun fact about Benicio del Toro in Star Wars. He originally was supposed to portray Darth Maul in The Phantom Menace, but he dropped out because he hated the fact that George Lucas cut the vast majority of his dialogue. Now let's move into the narrative of The Last Jedi. So this movie is basically the Battle of Hoth in reverse. In Empire Strikes Back, the Battle of Hoth took place on Hoth, the snow planet, and then led to the evacuation. In this movie, the evacuation happens first, then the battle on a salt planet called Crate happens at the very end. Now let's talk about the evacuation. Poe was to bring down something known as a dreadnought that basically is a Star Destroyer with a Death Star gun attached to it. And the whole opening feels like a really bad SNL skit. It basically is Poe going over the intercom, talking to Hux and going, "Can you hear me?" And, "Hey, your mom." And now this did lead to something though, as that's the actual bombers with bomb bay doors instead of just Y-wings. And the problem is they come across like they're basically made out of paper mache. They get destroyed way too easily, and it would have been more believable in Star Wars had they had shields protecting them, even with the bomb bay doors open. And apparently the First Order has light speed tracking that was never introduced in any prior movie. The scene I think of is Empire Strikes Back, when the Empire was going to pull the Falcon in with the tractor beam after they leave Bespin. Then the Falcon jumps to light speed or hyperspace, whatever you want to call it, and avoids the Empire. Why are we learning of this new technology now? And also, there's now fuel introduced, which it wasn't in Star Wars prior. There's a lot of new stuff that feels more like Star Trek than Star Wars. Now, this movie does destroy Star Wars lore in quite a few places, one of them being the hangar on the battleships. If you remember, those airlocks in the hangar also acted as shields, because in Revenge of the Sith, Anakin and Obi-Wan had to shoot it out before they could even enter the Trade Federation ship to save Palpatine. In this movie, Kylo Ren just shoots a missile into the hangar and pretty much destroys all the ships. And later on, the bridge gets blown up and only Leia survives. And this is basically Star Trek and Star Wars, getting back to my earlier comment. Typically in Star Wars, the shield covers the entirety of the ship. It's only in Star Trek where the shield can be forward or backward or move however it needs to move. Also, how does Leia survive being in the vacuum of space for that long? And basically, Vice Admiral Holdo comes in and takes over for Leia after being incapacitated. She's leaving Poe out of the conversation when it comes to a plan of action to get the First Order off their back. And then, as a result, he goes behind her back and talks with Finn and Rose about shutting down their lightspeed tracking. Maz Kanata recommends finding a master code breaker on a planet called Canto Bight. Now, really, the Canto Bight sequence can be boiled down to two things. Number one, rich people are bad, and number two, save the space horses! Now, Finn and Rose don't get the codebreaker that they want, so that's where DJ comes in. Then they find out that DJ stole the ship that they're taking back to the fleet, and it's discovered that the arms dealers are dealing to both sides of the conflict. Surprise, surprise there. And DJ later sells out Finn and Rose to the First Order essentially for money, which was funnier than shit. Oh yeah, Captain Phasma dies in this movie. This was such a waste of a character. She was built up before The Force Awakens even came out to be this big, badass character that is just now used for a punchline in the first movie, and then in this one, she just dies rather quickly. Now, before I get to the Battle of Crate, let's talk about Rey and Luke in this movie. When Rey turns over the lightsaber, Luke just throws it over his shoulder and just walks away from it altogether. Now, this was built on the last movie as a cliffhanger just to be thrown out in the next installment. And for those of you that don't know, there's a rule in storytelling called Anton's gun. Anton's gun is basically is written as, if a gun is placed on the wall in the first act, then it needs to be fired in the second act. So when people are saying that Rian Johnson doesn't understand basic storytelling, they're not entirely wrong, because he essentially ignored this, universal rule. Yeah, so getting back to The Last Jedi, Luke then goes on and on about how he didn't want to be found because he picked the most desolate place, the last place anyone would ever look. The problem with this logic is, why did Luke leave a map to find him in the prior movie if he doesn't want to be found? So now we've got the second chapter in a trilogy contradicting the first chapter. Then Rey gets drawn to the Jedi texts, and Luke agrees to give her 3 lessons, and by the way, in this movie, he only gives her 2 of those. Now, during the first one, Rey gets drawn to the dark side cave, very similarly to Luke being drawn to the Cave of Fears in Empire Strikes Back, and now Luke is having second thoughts. That's when he goes into the history about how the Jedi, in the height of their power, let Palpatine create the Empire, caused Darth Vader to betray them and wipe them out because the Jedi couldn't see past the tip of their noses. And yes, this was the point of the prequel trilogy, mind you. This isn't Rian Johnson pulling something out of his ass. Now, the Dark Side Cave doesn't really reveal anything, but Rey and Kylo Ren are basically communicating through the Force. Now, a lot of these Fandom Menace guys will have you believe, oh my god, this is lore breaking. However, they forget that the very same thing happened in The Empire Strikes Back when Luke and Vader were communicating through the Force at the very end of the movie, when Vader is back on his Star Destroyer and Luke is in the Millennium Falcon holding on to his cut off hand. So the idea of Rey and Kylo Ren basically using the Force to Skype each other is just expanded upon here. Now, Rey then learns the truth about why Luke is hiding on the island on Ahch-To. Oh, by the way, he's on the planet Ahch-To. It doesn't really matter. Luke tried to kill Kylo Ren in his sleep, and Kylo burned the Jedi Academy down, taking a view of the students with them. Now, I'm just assuming that that's how the Knights of Ren essentially formed, but it's not confirmed in the movie, nor was it even confirmed in the following one. Now, this is completely out of Luke's character. Knowing that he saved Vader in Return of the Jedi, why would he try to kill his own nephew before trying to save him like he did with his father? Now, Rey leaves and goes to see Kylo Ren to see if she can turn him. Now, Snoke then tortures her, and then Kylo Ren kills Snoke. Both he and Rey fight Snoke's guards. They're just like the Emperor's guards from Return of the Jedi. After this, Kylo tries to get Rey to join the dark side, and after this point, there's really no reason for Kylo to be evil. Han is dead, Snoke is dead, there's no outside influence. He's just evil for the sake of being evil. It then leads to a forced tug of war to get Anakin / Luke's lightsaber, and it splits into 2 pieces. Now, getting back to the Resistance, Vice Admiral Holdo forces all the troops onto the unprotected cruisers, and Poe stages a mutiny. Rightfully so, because a lot of people are gonna die. Now, here's the question. If Poe was in the wrong for staging this mutiny, then how did he get other people to help him in this attempted mutiny? Now, his plan is still in action, and there was nothing to stop the First Order from blowing up all the unprotected cruisers and killing everyone. The plan of protecting the cruisers by cloaking backfired because of Finn and Rose getting DJ involved, but that flaw was only clear in hindsight. Now, once all the cruisers have left and are getting blown up, Holdo positions the main starship to basically kamikaze into Snoke's Star Destroyer via lightspeed. Now, before this point, lightspeed was always referred to as hyperspace. It was always assumed that going to lightspeed meant that you were traveling through another dimension. It would explain how no one traveling through lightspeed died by collisions up to this point with other ships or crashing into a sun. This is yet another thing that Rian Johnson ruined in terms of the Star Wars, not lore-wise, but just within the rules of the universe. We then get to the Battle of Crate. The First Order has a battering ram cannon that'll blow through any armored door. To make a long story short, Finn was going to sacrifice himself by driving his speeder directly into the cannon to save the Resistance until Rose Tico came out of nowhere and T-boned him. and this was just an utter waste of a character. I'm referring to Finn here. After this, he was nothing more than just the token black character. Well, we need a black guy for this trilogy, and yeah, because the original trilogy had Lando Calrissian, the coolest cat in the galaxy. Then in the prequels, we had Mace Windu, and he was a badass Jedi. Shit, who are we gonna get for a black guy in this trilogy? Oh yeah, here's Finn. Now, he started this movie wanting to flee to save Rey and was called selfish for that. Now he's going to sacrifice himself for the greater good, and that was robbed from him. So let me ask the question now. What was the point to Finn's character other than to be the black guy in the trilogy? Now, Finn has to drag an unconscious Rose Tico across the battlefield. And here's the big question. Why didn't the First Order just aim their AT-ATs to shoot Finn and Rose right then and there? They were wide open, no cover in sight, but boom, there wouldn't have even been an arm over there and a leg over there. They would have just fucking evaporated. So Rey, at the very end of the movie, has to use the Force to lift all these boulders out of the way so the Resistance can escape onto the Falcon. She does this literally with no effort and no Force training of any kind, mind you, none of at least that we saw on screen. Luke only gave her 2 lessons, now one of which was used to connect to the Force, but I still highly doubt that she was this Grand Master by the very end. Now let's get to Luke versus Kylo Ren. Luke is basically just doing this to buy the Resistance time to escape, but it's not a traditional lightsaber duel. Luke is just a Force projection, and he dies using it. Let's assume that he died because Kylo Ren put his lightsaber through the Force projection. Or because, and I say this because earlier in the movie, Rey shot at him using the Force projection in the gut, and it did shoot him back, but he didn't die from it. Now, the Resistance flees, and this is where Poe and Rey first meet. It's just, hey, I'm Poe. And Rey just shrugging and going, okay, end of the movie. Now let's look at the reception of The Last Jedi. This movie has a Rotten Tomatoes critic score of 91% out of 482 reviews and an audience score of 43% out of 219,054 reviews. Essentially, this is less reviews than The Force Awakens got. Now, it received a Metacritic score of 84 out of 56 critic reviews and a user score of 4.3 out of 10 out of 8,771 ratings. It sits at a 7 out of 10 on IMDb, and that's out of 536,531 reviews. Now, this movie was made on a budget of $317 million and grossed $1,332,539,889 back in 2017 going into 2018. So that in 2020 dollars would be $1,403,184,291.16. Now, the big question is, what was the drop-off from The Force Awakens to The Last Jedi in terms of box office? Well, that drop-off was 35.6%. Now, keep in mind, this does not account for repeat viewings of either movie, because that is something that is not and will not and cannot ever be measured. So now let's end off The Last Jedi with my final thoughts. Now, this movie was clearly designed to be a subversion of what a Star Wars movie is. This idea would have been okay had this movie not been Episode 8. Had this movie been in its own separate trilogy, I don't think the backlash would have been as severe. Now, and I will say this is the only movie in the sequel trilogy to have a narrative of any substance that isn't just full of fan service left and right. That right there, I have to give Rian Johnson the credit for bringing that to the sequel trilogy. Now, that doesn't mean that the narrative is good and what was brought to the table was good. It was just, at this point, I'll take anything. The main issue with this movie is it feels like a closing chapter of a trilogy instead of the middle chapter. I don't mind the Resistance losing and failing throughout the movie. It was just so poorly executed that it fractured the fan base along with changing the rules of the universe by having Leia survive the vacuum of space and having hold a weaponized light speed. I'm not the first one to say this, but Rian Johnson was just being avant-garde just to be avant-garde. And this was the first Star Wars movie where we saw a clear divide between the critics and the audience. Like I said, there were less audience reviews on this movie than The Force Awakens, and it got a lower score. The theory that a small vocal minority caused all this damage, in my opinion, is simply not true. Yes, there is a small vocal minority out there. I'm not denying their existence. But if they echo the feelings of the silent majority, then all of a sudden, it's no longer just a small minority. And I'll expand on that point at the very end of this episode. Now let's move into the final chapter of this trilogy, Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. We'll start off with the characters, and like we did with The Last Jedi, we'll start off with the returning characters. Let's start off with Rey. In this movie, we basically learn that she's a Palpatine, which at this point, in my opinion, is just a last-ditch Hail Mary pass to save this character. Because other than this revelation, she doesn't really grow. She's still the same Mary Sue-style character that was in The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. Now let's move on to Finn. In this movie, it is alluded to that he is Force-sensitive. However, it's only in one scene between him and a new character named Janna. And it's never talked about again in this movie, nor is it focused on during the final battle on Exegol. Safe to say, he's pushed to the sidelines yet again. Then we get to Poe. He pretty much becomes a background character in this movie. Nothing else is shown in this movie other than, hey, he's a good pilot. Which leads me to believe that I feel that there was no plans for this character after his death on Jakku, and then being brought back to life by JJ during The Force Awakens. More was done to this character in The Last Jedi. Now, it was quite damaging, but it was at least something. And now we move on to Kylo Ren. He's actually not as whiny in this movie. He starts out being bad for the sake of being bad, and then he turns good. Him turning good is so poorly executed that it does come across as the last-ditch Hail Mary pass to save this character from just being one-dimensional. Then we get to General Hux. He becomes a spy for the Resistance. Again, just another Hail Mary to justify his existence beyond The Force Awakens, because General Hux told Finn, I don't want you to win, but I need Kylo to lose. Why? So that General Hux will gain all this power within the First Order. Then we get to Rose Tico, who is basically written out of the movie. She's only in the movie for maybe 5 minutes grand total. Then we see Leia, but Leia is only in archive footage, and it's really awkward to watch it because the movie almost becomes a modern interpretation of Plan 9 from Outer Space. For those of you that don't know what Plan 9 from Outer Space is, it was Bela Lugosi's last movie, and he died before it was finished filming, and Ed Wood decided to take all this footage of Bela Lugosi and shoot around it, and just intercut all that footage with Bela Lugosi, and that's how we got Plan 9 from Outer Space, which is still considered one of the worst movies ever made. Then we see Luke Skywalker in this movie. He basically just returns as a Force ghost in the same vein that Ben Kenobi did in Return of the Jedi for Luke when they had the one-on-one conversation on Dagobah after Yoda's passing. He returns when Rey goes to Ahch-To to basically pull Luke Skywalker and just hide there forever. And then we get to Han Solo, not in a Force ghost, but a figment of Kylo Ren's imagination. Yeah, this is where the movie kind of got weird. Now let's talk about the new characters. So the first one I want to talk about is Kerry Russell as Zori Bliss. Now she's the former love interest for Poe Dameron, and her character is really only seen in 3 scenes the entire movie. Really just an absolute waste of a character trying to introduce someone like her in the final chapter. And then we have Shirley Henderson as Babu Frick, a black market droid hacker that is used to help bypass C-3PO's protocols to get him to translate something in the ancient Sith language. I actually found Babu Frick to be quite enjoyable. I found him to be really funny. Then we have Naomi Ackie as Janna. Now, not much is revealed about her outside of the fact that she was another First Order defector just like Finn. And it's alluded to that she's Force sensitive as well, but it's only brought up once and never expanded upon. Then we have Dio, the droid, voiced by J.J. Abrams. Basically, it's a droid that is a desk lamp on a wheel. And that's really all there is to it. And finally, we have Ian McDiarmid back as Palpatine. He comes back from the dead somehow. It's really not explained. He wants Kylo Ren to bring Rey to him, and in exchange, Kylo Ren gets a new empire. And really, he just feels like a last-minute addition to this movie. Now let's get into the narrative of Rise of Skywalker. So in the first 5 minutes, we see Kylo Ren killing a bunch of people on an unknown planet to retrieve a holocron to go to Exegol, the Sith homeworld. And I only know that because of my knowledge on the expanded universe. Anyways, we learned that Palpatine has been resurrected. No explanation, just resurrected out of nowhere. Kylo Ren seeks out Palpatine to destroy him because he's a threat to his power. So, how does Kylo Ren know that Palpatine has been resurrected? That's never explained in the movie. Now, it is revealed that Snoke was just a clone that was created by Palpatine, and it was Palpatine putting all the voices in Kylo's head. It wasn't Rian Johnson that ruined Snoke now. This was all J.J. Abrams. Snoke was built up to be the main villain of this trilogy just to get killed off in The Last Jedi, and now he was just a clone. Apparently, the First Order was a contingency plan created by Palpatine, and again, it's totally believable that he would create a contingency plan in the case of his death so that the Empire could live on. But he's been building a second empire for the last 30 plus years on Exegol with what looks like thousands of Star Destroyers called the Final Order. And none of this is explained any further in the movie. And keep in mind, this is just within the first 5 to 10 minutes. So this movie is basically Rey picking up the trail where Luke left off in his quest of finding Exegol. In this process, we go from Desert Planet, where we encounter a worm from the Dune series, a Snow Planet where we see Poe's former love interest in Zori, and finally landing on another moon of Endor to board the remnants of the Death Star 2. Yes, apparently there was a Sith holocron that could lead to Exegol that survived the crash with no damage and being exposed to the elements for 30 plus years. Why, do you ask? Because, well, I think because plot. That's JJ's go-to answer for anything at this point. Rey then fights Kylo Ren in a very anticlimactic battle where she force heals him after stabbing him with his own lightsaber. Then Han comes in somehow. It's not a Force ghost. It's like a memory that Ben was projecting. And this is where Kylo Ren turns good because of Daddy in his mind. Now let's jump to the Battle of Exegol. And now this is handled in 2 stages. There's an air attack to prevent the Final Order fleet from leaving. In this Final Order fleet, they all have Death Star guns that can wipe out an entire planet. They did that to incite the rebellion to go to Exegol. And just like the bombers from The Last Jedi, the guns and Star Destroyers are made out of paper mache. In order to stop the fleet from leaving Exegol, the Resistance has to take down a transmission tower that helps the fleet of that size to leave. Now, once the tower is destroyed, the Resistance leaves since the fleet can't leave and are just stuck there for all eternity. Now, the Knights of Ren come back into this movie after being only seen in Rey's Force vision in The Force Awakens. They feel like really a last-minute addition. At some point, the Knights of Ren turn on Kylo Ren, and it's not explained at all. It just happens. Rey goes to Exegol to confront Palpatine. Palpatine wants her to strike him down so that his spirit will transfer into her, along with all of the Sith. She refuses, and Kylo Ren comes in to help. During this time, Palpatine drains the life force from Rey and Kylo to make him complete again. Rey then strikes him down, essentially doing what Palpatine wanted to do from the beginning. Kylo Ren force heals her, and he basically dies. The movie ends by Rey going back to the moisture farm on Tatooine to bury Luke and Leia's lightsabers. The problem with this logic is Leia never lived at the moisture farm. She was from Alderaan, which got destroyed by the Death Star in Episode 4. And remember, in that same movie, Luke wanted to leave the moisture farm to join the Academy to become a pilot. Then Rey takes up the name Skywalker. Now, I saw this twist coming from a mile away because, hey, we gotta do everything we can to save Rey. Then Rey and BB-8 are standing over that pit in the moisture farm with the twin sunset, and it's the end of the movie. Now, the reception for Rise of Skywalker. This movie has a Rotten Tomatoes critic score of 52% out of 483 critic reviews and has an audience score of 86% out of 98,226 reviews. It has a Metacritic score of 53 out of 61 critic reviews and a user score of 4.8 out of 10 out of 4,718 ratings. Now, this movie sits at 6.7 out of 10 on IMDb out of 317,380 reviews. This movie was made on a budget of $275 million, and it grossed $1,074,144,248. Now, I'm not going to adjust for inflation in 2020 because this was released within the last 2 to 3 weeks of 2019, so the inflation rate would only go up by maybe less than a percent. So, what was the drop-off between The Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker in terms of box office? It was only 19.3%. Now, it's safe to say that this movie benefited from good word of mouth because I was actually predicting that the drop-off would be a lot larger. Now, this movie does have a normal drop-off between sequels. A normal drop-off between sequels is about 20 to 30%. But now, let's look at the total drop-off from The Force Awakens to The Rise of Skywalker, and that was 48%. Now, this could mean one of two things. Either 48% of the audience lost faith in this trilogy, or repeat viewings decreased significantly. The drop-off could be a result of both of these things if I'm being genuinely honest. So what are my final thoughts on The Rise of Skywalker? Now, I knew that I blew through this movie's narrative section, but I blew through it for one main reason. I really don't give a fuck about this movie. What this movie accomplished was it made episodes 7 and 8 actually worse retroactively. The characters of Rey, Finn, and Poe had a lot of potential in The Force Awakens and even The Last Jedi, and JJ comes back and does absolutely nothing with them. Remember how Snoke was built up to be the big bad villain of the trilogy? Yeah, he's just a clone that Palpatine created. Remember when Holdo weaponized lightspeed against the First Order in The Last Jedi? Yeah, by this movie, that was just a 1 in a million shot. Everything else that's going on in this movie happens so fast that you can't really make sense of it all. In fact, you're probably going to forget it by the time that the movie is over. Now, the common defense of J.J. Abrams' Rise of Skywalker is, oh, he had to cram 2 movies worth of content into one. I'll explore that point deeper in a minute. Now, the biggest issue with this movie narratively is you have to buy the novelization in order to understand what is actually happening on screen because nothing is explained in the movie. Now, apparently, the novelization even contradicts what's on the screen. Now, an important note, that's only what I heard through the grapevine. So do take that point with a grain of salt. I have not personally read the novelization, nor do I care to. So I'm finally going to conclude this episode with my final thoughts on the Star Wars sequel trilogy as a whole. Now, this is probably the most disjointed trilogy narrative-wise. This trilogy started as a rehash of A New Hope that led into a retcon of the rehash of A New Hope that ended with a retcon of the retcon of the rehash of A New Hope. If the plan was to end the trilogy with Palpatine coming back, then why didn't The Force Awakens and Last Jedi focus on this more? Why wasn't the First Order searching for an artifact that would have brought Palpatine back to life in The Force Awakens instead of a map to Luke Skywalker of all people? Then Episode 8 would have to play out differently, that way Episode 9 at least would make sense. Now, getting back to this, the common defense for Episode 9 is, well, JJ had to squeeze 2 movies worth of content into one. Well, that's a problem that JJ himself created going back to The Force Awakens. JJ left a lot of narrative threads wide open because movies are a mystery box. Ooh! Perfect examples were who's Snoke? Who are Rey's parents? Even though this one was complete BS in my opinion. Who are the Knights of Ren? What is the First Order? What led to the creation of the First Order? All valid questions. So let's get back to JJ. He left these narrative threads so open for anyone after him to come in and finish them off however they saw fit, and I believe that this was an intentional move by JJ. Remember, before Star Wars, he was credited for killing Star Trek in just 2 movies. So, if he left these narrative threads open for anyone to come along and wrap them up as they saw fit, Rian Johnson, then that person can be the fall guy when this trilogy goes tits up. JJ can now run out and say, see, I didn't kill Star Wars, it was that guy over there, Rian Johnson. Now, this was not a defense of Rian Johnson. Rian Johnson certainly didn't help the problem, but he sure as shit didn't create it. Now, I'm going to end this episode off with this final question. I'm going to leave this final question on the table. Is where will this trilogy be in the next 20 years? Will it be as beloved as the prequel trilogy is now? And I'm going to answer that here honestly. Only time will tell when it comes to those questions. But I'll end the episode off with this, and I know I'm kind of repeating myself here. What happens when you strip away the nostalgia and fan service moments from this trilogy? What are you left with? In my opinion, you are left with a paper-thin narrative with these new characters getting underdeveloped, which leads to talk of missed opportunities with the characters of Finn, and the old characters either getting pushed to the side or crapped all over for the sake of pushing the new underdeveloped characters. You can't take that away from this trilogy, no matter if you love it or hate it.